All right, folks, welcome back to the Contrarians. We've got another conceptual panel planned here. We are calling this one "Not All Good Grunge Comes from Seattle." So obviously, we realize that the whole grunge scene, the magic of the grunge scene, the origins of it. You know, there's this chemistry with Seattle. It's the Northwest. It never really had a scene ever before. It had some bands. We had Metal Church and Heart, and famously Jimi Hendrix and stuff like that. But yeah, it's not a place that particularly had much of a scene, and this was a definite scene that centered there. It was a magical, huge scene. There were some huge bands coming out of that. Even some diamond albums, and but yeah, the idea is this was a really kind of a cool music. It took the world by storm, and there were pockets here and there. So yeah, we've assembled an esteemed batch of wise music swamis here to remind us that not all of it has to come from Seattle. And I've got a bunch of examples here too, but I think we'll get into it a little bit about influence and where were those bands influenced by? Were these bands from away influenced by the Seattle thing, or were they influenced by kind of the same things? So yeah, I think there's some deeper points to be made here, and I'm not sure how these guys are going to handle it, but yeah, I've got a pile of examples here, and I got to the point where I don't even know if showing piles of examples is the way to go with this, but I think the concepts will come out as we go here. So let's start with Phil. Tell me your take on this idea. How much good grunge came not from Seattle?
Right. Okay. First off, I have to say that I never been a big grunge fan.
Yeah.
I'm a 90s kid, or I was a 90s kid. I'm no longer a kid. And being into metal, I thought, I should follow the consensus, which is that grunge is garbage. That's only for losers or whatever, and therefore, I shouldn't be listening to Nirvana. I should insist on listening only to quality metal, whatever that may be. Later on, growing up, I actually realized, in my mid 20s, late 20s, that in fact there are grunge bands which are really like great quality, far more superior musicians. Some of these bands, especially like Soundgarden, who became my favorite grunge band, and Alice in Chains, have insane musicality. They have great chops. They have great, yeah, musicianship, but also great composition skills. And they really broke a lot of new ground, more than some of the metal bands that I was really into in the 90s. So I definitely regretted at some point not being interested in grunge, getting into it older. And, I had to obviously mature a bit more to actually realize that there are many fine qualities in some grunge bands. Although I never got into Nirvana, I have absolute respect for what they did, and especially for Kurt Cobain for being some form of, let's say, genius in quotation marks. But anyway, I have approached this not being a big grunge fan. I've approached it a bit from a left field. Uh, First off, I'll go with what I think is maybe one of the most obvious answers, and that would be with Stone Temple Pilots. I'm sure that the other guys here you will all probably also bring them up. So they formed in San Diego, so not in Seattle, in 1989. So more or less at the point where most grunge bands were forming and where they would start releasing their first, where they would first start really exploding onto the scene in the late 80s, early 90s. And for me, it's mostly with them, their first two albums, Core and Purple. Again, these guys are classified, according to the grunge canon. Uh, Maybe we should define what grunge is musically, if we can use a few terms to distinguish what it is. But for me, grunge is supposed to be very gnarly, very noisy, dissonant, badly recorded singers who are very charismatic, but at the same time they sing as though they are pushing through the mud, and they are carrying with them a lot of angst and anger and demons, all of their personal demons. Um, but for me, these guys never really sounded so much like what Nirvana did. Maybe Nirvana was the only real canonical grunge band. These guys do have some of those elements. The great Scott Weiland, one of the greatest singers of his generation by far, he does sing with that style, like this voice that's kind of dragging a bit, you know. I don't have the right vocabulary right now to describe him, but he did have a bit of that style. He did have, his own demons, and he was singing a lot, I think, about them. And he had a way of interpreting the lyrics that was in a way that was akin to what we would call grunge, this style of singing. But in their music, I hear a lot of Zeppelin influences, a lot of like mid-era, late-era Zeppelin influences in the guitars of Dean DeLeo, and I think that um, I could not put them easily next to Nirvana. They never sounded so noisy or dissonant. They had actually a lot of sweet elements to their music and their sound, a lot of fantastic melodies, a lot of very nice in the pocket kind of groove. But anyway, they are classified as a grunge band, so we'll go with that. I also hear in them a lot of influences from Pearl Jam, a lot of that universe that we associate with Pearl Jam, the kind of singing that's like storytelling, the way Eddie Vedder famously does it with that kind of low voice, that sort of Bruce Springsteen sort of style of voice. Um, Okay, moving on. This is where I'm coming really in from the left field. Doing a bit of research and listening a bit more to bands from the early 90s who were not, let's say, prog or metal. Uh, I kind of realized that at least the first album of Caius is grunge. This is a very, again, I'm coming from a left field sort of. Caius are a desert rock. They're desert rock pioneers. They're the ones who basically more or less created what we call desert rock, stoner rock. But for me, their first album called Wretch. And from that lineup, you would see Josh Homme then going on to playing for Screaming Trees, who are also classified as grunge. For me, this band has all the sludgy elements that we associate also with early Soundgarden, drop D tuning, dissonance, again, very muddy, sludgy riffs, a style of singing that's again as though pushing through the mud, and kind of like almost like a struggle, the way that they sound and the singing. Later on, their style will become more refined, and when you get to Welcome to Sky Valley, it's obviously what we call more of this Black Sabbath sort of thing of desert rock. But anyway, their first album for me, at that moment, they are a grunge band, definitely. And then I thought, you know what? Let's go back home where I come from. I've talked a lot here about how I come from Greece. And last summer, I had the chance of seeing live the only Greek grunge band at the moment, or at least, the only Greek band that's classified as grunge. Maybe you can see their picture here. They are called Prince of Lilies. Inspired by a fresco, a fresco from an ancient palace from the island of Crete. Their album is called Vent, and these guys have a lot of influences from Smashing Pumpkins, most definitely. A lot of the melodic poppy side of Smashing Pumpkins. They have a lot of influences from the Stooges, a lot of grunge, garage elements, very raw kind of style, noisy riffs. And on top of that, these guys, who are a small Greek band, were produced by Steve Albini, who famously has worked with Nirvana, the Pixies, the Stooges. So that's not a coincidence. And to finish and continue with what has been going on in my homeland, and again to come from a left field, I want to talk about the Greek band 1000 Mods. I'm sure Jamie's familiar with them. I've seen them in his collection on his Facebook
I
page.
just saw them live about 4 months ago.
Oh, cool. Sweet. Yeah. So these guys are the most popular Greek band in the world right now. They have managed to tour from Europe to the US, to Australia, New Zealand, everywhere. They're a desert rock band inspired by Caius and Monster Magnet, but their last album, they totally went into a grunge territory. They actually went to Seattle. They worked hard and went to Seattle. They worked at Studio Litho with Matt Bayliss, who has worked with Pearl Jam. And they basically said themselves they were inspired by the 90s. They wanted to make a 90s grunge album, which is what they did. It's called Youth of Dissent. The lyrics are no longer party lyrics or about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but they are more like angry, darker, about, again, struggling with your personal demons, or about an angry youth. Back home, the youth always have a good reason to be angry. And their music is much more dark, much more sludgy, and it feels a lot like also the singing is not this kind of laid back, cool kind of desert rock singing, but more of really like singing through the mud and sludge, and it's kind of dissonant. The riffs are more dissonant rather than kind of desert rock Monster Magnet style. So everyone
Dissident Pearl Jam song, by the way. You're fitting in grunge Easter eggs.
Oh, sweet, cool. All right, so you should totally touch on that later. Yeah. So just to finish, especially the local press in Greece, when this album came out, everyone was kind of shocked. Not most people didn't like it. I'm not sure I like it, but everyone basically agreed that okay, these guys are now basically a grunge band. They went to Seattle and they did their sort of grunge thing. So, if you're interested, have a look at these smaller bands from Greece. And I don't know what you think about Caius. Was their first album grunge or not? Is early desert rock grunge maybe instead? So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Nice. Well, just add a couple of quick comments and then we'll move on to Jamie. But so Stone Temple Pilots is probably going to be the number one best example of this because they were a massive band. I think they're the mean median average of grunge. They hate being called grunge, those guys. But you can't get more of a grunge name than Stone Temple Pilots. And you can't get more of a grunge thing by having a band named that and then calling your album Core, right? And just like Prince of Lily's Bent, right? Sort of thing, right? So and Caius, their album's called Wretch, which is a perfect name for a grunge album. And I think we're going to see a little bit of this stoner rock, desert rock crossover into grunge. They're kind of the same sort of thing, and a quick definition of grunge, I would say Black Sabbath crossed with Led Zeppelin, crossed with punk, crossed with post-punk. You pretty much got it at that point. But let's move on to Jamie. What do you got? Actually, before we move on, I need to flash my Seattle's Best cup here, so to get the spirit of things. So sorry about that. Go ahead, Jamie.
For the record, I've never been a big fan of Stone Temple Pilots. I've tried many times. There's a few songs off of Purple I liked when it first came out. Then I listened to it these days, and I'm not a big fan. Kitchen Hardware and Candy Bars or something like that. It was a decent song, but yeah. I took some liberties with the word grunge, and I kind of went after post Nevermind. First of all, here's the thing. I made a grunge section out of my CDs recently because they don't fit into alternative rock anymore as time goes on. It's just kind of heavy rock, but I don't want to put it in hard rock or heavy metal. So I'm like, I'm just going to try my best to make a grunge section. And I came across the band, and I never know what to do with this band, where to put them. Just don't make genres out of your CD collection. I know, but I do. What do you do with King's X? Do they have grunge in their music at all? Because I think it was Mike McCready, someone from Pearl Jam said, I think they invented grunge.
They're a prog band. Prog.
Yeah, I did put them in prog metal. That's where they are with Dream Theater and Opeth and stuff. But at the same time, I hear some grunge in their music. I do. Especially that Dogman CD. I think it blended right in with what was coming out in 1993 or 92 or whatever year the album is. Going from there, I'm going to talk about 3 bands from the 90s that just blended in with the whole grunge thing, even if they weren't hardcore grunge. You heard them on the radio next to Nirvana and Pearl Jam, and it didn't sound out of place. And the thing is with these bands, the albums I love, man, I love them. And I'm still playing them later, 30 years later, As a lot of CDs go by the wayside, these albums are still in rotation in my life. But then they have some albums that I just don't care about at all or didn't even buy because I'm like, eh. And the first one, I'm going to go most grunge to less grunge here. And the first one is the shirt I'm wearing, Everclear. And where are they from, Martin? Are they from California? No, they're from Oregon.
Portland,
yeah.
yeah.
They sound
I've got them out as well. Absolutely.
They sound like
one
a California band in my
too.
ears for some reason.
What's that?
Here's the weird thing, and I think we're going to be opposite on this, Martin. I like the later albums better than the earlier albums, and I think you're going to be opposite. Now, the first album is pretty raw. I think they recorded it for about $400 or something like that. And even though it's raw, you can see the songwriting there. What's his name? Alex. God, I didn't write down his name. He's got a weird last name.
Alex.
Yeah, is that what it is?
Yeah.
That last name isn't that weird at all. He's got a certain style in his songwriting.
Alexakis.
I knew it was a little weird. In the songwriting style is still there on the first album. It's just very raw. It hasn't changed over the albums. But they finally got, hits on the second album here, Sparkle and Fade. And then they started cleaning up even more on So Much for the Afterglow. But man, I think for me personally, Songs from American Movie Volume 1, I think this is just, as Martin would say, an absolute masterpiece. And I hate using the word masterpiece because I think it's way overused. But I also think when we say it, the viewers know kind of what we're saying. It's an album that's near perfect. You don't skip songs on it. So that's how I'm using it. And they did a follow-up the year later, Volume 2. I don't think it's more raw. And here we go with Laszlo, like in the more cleaned up Everclear. I like my Everclear more cleaned up and more Beatles-like, I guess. And the funny thing is, remember the old album homework assignment show over on Sea of Tranquility? I gave Pete this to listen to. I said, I want you to listen to Volume 1, the songs from American Movie. He said, okay. We did the show. He listened to Volume 2. It's like, Pete, and he hated it. I'm like, I knew you'd hate Volume 2. That's why I gave you this. And then he did listen to Volume 1 and text me. He says, I hate Volume 1 too, even though it's a little better. Yeah. So, and I think, man, and then they did, which one is this? Slow Motion Daydream. The 2000s, Everclear, I think wrote and performed some of the best songs of that decade, of the OOs ever. And I will say, Wonderful off of this one. If I did a top 10, 25 to 50 songs, it would be in there as one of the best songs ever written. And that is my first one, was Everclear. But do I listen to the first album that much? No, but I was listening yesterday. I'm like, I need to listen to that album more often. And then some later ones, like Black is the New Black, Invisible Stars, I didn't even buy them because I sampled them like, eh. So I drop off quick with a lot of these bands. I'm like, yes. And then I'm like, nah, it's weird. Second one, I'm going to go to Detroit. And this band has a lot of Detroit in their sound, but they also have a kind of a grunge sound, especially on their first album. And I actually have a bumper sticker from like 1990. When was the first album? 1995 or 94? I found this at a flea market for like $1. I'm like, I'm never going to see this again. Look at that bumper sticker. I keep it up in the bar too, because I'm like, this is just too cool. I don't know how many they made, but I got one. So the first album, Rotting Pinata, Pinata. Yeah, Pinata, has some great songs on it. Great songs that got played on the radio with like Molly and what was the other one? Plowed. Was that the one that got played on the radio? I think Plowed, yeah. But it is a little spotty. But when it's good, it's way good. So I'm spotty with these bands, also spotty with some of the albums. But when they released Wax S Static, I thought this was just absolute masterpiece. It's just good from start to end. The title track is great, and these guys got that Detroit sound, so they got a little bit of Iggy in the Stooges and they got a little bit of Rick Derringer in them. They got a little glam in them. They got a little punk in them. They got a little grunge in them. And they just, some of their stuff, even with the title track, Wax Aesthetic, has a little, in my purity, has a little industrial elements in it too, a little 9 Inch Nails going on. So they're all over the place. And then they do this album next, New Pop Sunday. I don't own any album that sounds like this. I was listening to it yesterday. I'm like, there's nothing on my shelf that comes close to sounding like this. Very garagey, kind of grungy, kind of glammy. The singing is weird. It's like when he sings, I met the dude too, and I forget his damn name. I should have wrote all that down. Vinny Dombrowski. When he sings, it sounds like he's a half a step behind the band, but at the same time, it kind of works. And then in 2003, I think they released their second best album, For All the Drugs in the World. And look how awful that cover is. Look, it looks like it was thrown together for like a cheap best of sponge that you find at like, I don't know, like Walmart or something. But this has like Treat Me Wrong, Leave This World. If you gave up on Sponge in the 90s, check this out from 2003. And I saw them on this tour, and we drove into the middle of nowhere in Ohio. I don't even know how I found out about this concert, into this little bar. And there were 12 of us in there, 12 of us on folding chairs in front of the band. It was great. But they do have some crap. The Man is them trying to be Alice in Chains. So this is way grungy. It didn't work. Galore has some moments, but it's okay. But they released an album in 2021, Lavatorium, and it kind of stinks. I'm not going to lie. So you see, I drop off. And my third pick is, I'm not going to talk about the Smashing Pumpkins because I'm going to leave that to Martin, but I'll tell you what, their first 4 or 5 albums, that's a good run. I'm going to go with something that, a band that kind of gets, they're alt country, they're alternative rock, but they do get punky and grungy. And that is a band, their first 4 albums, man. Cracker. Love these guys. David Lowery. He was born in Texas. He formed Camper Van Beethoven in California in 83. Then in 1990, somehow in Richmond, he formed Cracker. And Camper Van Beethoven is kind of a country rock, alternative, quirky band. You know, they're all over the place. This band, man, this album is very good. And the hit off of this was Teen Angst. What the world needs now is another folk singer. People are like, oh, that's the name of that album, that song. Yes, Teen Angst. They had a minor hit with that. But then came Kerosene Hat. Ooh, man, solid front to back. And I tell you what, Low, Like Being Stoned, one of the best songs of the 90s. I was just playing this last weekend, man. And I think it's one of the best albums of the 90s. You got quirky songs, you know, kind of like Camper Van Beethoven a little bit with Movie Star. But get off this, what a driving, dancing style, you know, almost like an R&B rhythm to it. And they got these great slow songs that are just like almost twangy. And they're not even short, but they never get boring, and they're full of heart and soul. So I was like, these guys, this is as good as they're ever gonna get. No, Laszlo. They did the golden age, and it's even better. This album, you know, one of these days I'm gonna do a top 10, 50 albums of all time and just see how it shakes out. And this has got to be in there. I mean, I've been listening to this since the day it came out in 95 or 96. And I remember exactly where I was when I was listening to it for the first time. It came out in April. It was kind of that first warm day of the year. And I was sitting out back on the back steps of our condo that we all kind of were roommates in. And I put it on, and man, it just hit the spot. And every time I listen to it, I'm back on that stoop, on that step in the back of our condo, listening to it again. And it's got rockers on here, man. But it's got like these slow things like Big Dipper. If you listen to Big Dipper, it has these guitar chords that just strum once, And that's all it needs to do, just go boom, and you're deep into the song. But I Hate My Generation is very grungy at the same time. So Cracker's where it's at. Again, though, you would think, oh, wow, he loves these albums so much, he must love all the Cracker. Well, I got Gentleman's Blues next, and it was okay. It's got some good songs. And then I got their little 2 CD comp after that with some live stuff and kind of like a greatest hits. And then I started just downloading the rest of the albums. I have MP3 versions of them. And do I ever go back to those? Do I ever feel like I need to own those? No, but though that second and third album, man, it just doesn't get better than 90s grungy type music than that for me.
Yeah.
Ah.
Cool. Yeah,
Jamie,
pretty cool.
You mentioned earlier the band Sponge. You said something that they have a lot of Detroit in them. What is it? What does Detroit sound like exactly?
Garagey a little bit. I think of like garagey and like a little messy. You know, MC5, they're from
Okay.
Detroit, right?
Yeah.
A little bit of MC5y going on there. They're not, especially that third album. It's just a little bit messy and garagey.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I don't know if I'd call Cracker particularly grungy. I mean, it's very beautifully recorded. It's got a lot of alt country to them, right? A lot of
Yes.
folk rock too. I love them to death too. I love Kerosene Hat. Yeah, the lyrics are amazing.
Yeah, I took some liberties with that one because when will I ever be able to talk about Cracker
Exactly, yeah.
again? So
We should find another place. But
Yeah.
yeah, I just wanted to mention Everclear would be probably my second favorite grunge album from Away. I mean, look how these guys definitely look. I mean, look at this picture. There's Kurt Cobain himself practically right there, right? So that'd be my second. And you know, I don't really consider King's X grungy. I mean, Dogman is as grungy as they got, produced by Brendan O'Brien, 1994. It was like pointedly they're trying to be a little more low down and down tuned and slower and heavier and bassier and stuff. But the big thing about those guys, they're super creative like a grunge band, and all the grunge people loved them. They all looked up to those guys. So anyways, over to Parish.
Thanks, Martin. Well, I thought I'd look at the UK grunge scene, just to be different. And of course, we had a huge grunge scene over here. We probably had 6 bands, I think, or maybe even 7. So a really big scene. But I'm not going to talk about the 2 obvious ones. So I'm not going to talk about Bush, who big in America, 20 million albums sold around the world, 6 of which I think were in the UK because they did nothing over here. So I'm not going to talk about them. I'm also not going to talk about early Radiohead with songs like Creep, which I think would fit in nicely. That first couple of albums I think would fit in quite well into talking about grunge, but I'm not going to talk about them either. So the first band I'm going to talk about is a band called Stiltskin. Now, Stiltskin, first of all, I love the name. I think it's one of the best names for a band, you know, sort of like Rumpelstiltskin. I just think it's a great name. And they were kind of one-hit wonders, although they have reformed and they're still going. The lead singer and frontman is a guy called Ray Wilson. And you'll know Ray Wilson because he joined Genesis and was actually part of Genesis from 96 to 2000 and is the singer on Calling All Stations. So that's kind of where he became famous. He's also toured with Steve Hackett over the years. But Stiltskin, they're known best for a #1 single that they had in the UK called Inside. And Inside I would best describe as prog grunge. It starts with sort of like a choral opening. It builds slowly. It's got a lot of key changes, but it's a definitely grunge sound to it. But as I say, quite proggy in it. And it was obviously going to be a #1 single because the lyrics were about the sort of subjects that everybody thinks would get to #1, about oppression. It's about Plato's allegory of the cave, all the things that always cry out #1 single. And I think maybe it was helped a little bit along the way that it was picked up by a Levi's ad as well. I think that might have helped it get to #1. And it was actually top 10 across most of Europe, but did nothing outside of Europe. They did the album it comes from is called Mind's Eye. I think it's a really good album. It's quite typically grunge, but so if you heard it, you'd think it fits in with Pearl Jam or with Nirvana quite well. But they do then have some songs that don't. They've got a song called Rest in Peace that is very sort of light 60s pop. and they've got a song called Sunshine and Butterflies, where the guy just sounds like it sounds like Billy Idol doing grunge, if you could imagine that. The vocals very Billy Idol, although the song itself is quite grungy. So I think that's a great album, The Mind's Eye. There's no doubt to me that Inside is the best track off that album. They did a couple more albums afterwards that did nothing, hence why I think he was picked. But I think he was picked up by Genesis by seeing him play touring around that time. I saw them live. I happened to, by chance, walk into a bar in Edinburgh in the early 2000s, and they just started playing, and they were really good live, a really good band. So I'm not surprised that they're kind of back again, and they're touring all the bars and clubs and sort of low down on the festival circuit, because they're a good band. But certainly worth listening to. If you're going to give them a listen, try the song Inside. It's got quite an interesting video as well on YouTube. So that's my first one, Stiltskin. Yeah. My second one, which you may have heard of, is this band, if you can see that, The Wild Hearts. Right. Yeah. So apologies, it's on cassette. That's what I was buying back in the early 90s. So The Wild Hearts formed in 89. There's elements of grunge, there's elements of punk, there's elements of alt rock. But they're also very melodic, and I've always described them almost as a grunge Cheap Trick, really, if you can imagine that. They're led by the founder, Ginger. They've had loads of members in the band over the years. They keep splitting up, they reform, they split up. I mean, I've no idea whether they've split up or reformed. I thought they'd split up, read something that they're touring again, so they've clearly reformed, I think. But the first four albums are the four albums which I think are by far the best and are the typical grunge ones. So the first one is the one I just shown, Earth versus the Wild Hearts, came out in 93, had quite a big hit called TV Town. But they've got a couple of other songs on there that are really commercial. I don't know for the life of me why they were never released as singles. One is called Greetings from Shitsville, and the other one is My Baby is a Head Fuck. Now, I've no idea why they weren't released as singles, because, as I say, really catchy. In fact, even the last one, Baby is a Head Fuck, has actually got a Day Tripper sample running through it as well. So should have been a single. Maybe if they'd changed the lyrics slightly, it could have been. But excellent. They then had a modest hit with a single called Caffeine Bomb. Wasn't on the albums at the time, but I think if you pick it up as a CD now, I think the first one, Earth versus Wild Hearts, you'd get that on it. The next one is called Don't Be Happy, Just Worry, was their next album, which was actually released originally just for the fan club, and then kind of had some extra tracks added to it and released as a sort of like a mini album. And then my favourite album is the album which is spelt out as letters PHUQ, but pronounced obviously fuck. And it had what I think is one of the best singles of the 90s, I Want to Go Where the People Go. I just think it's a fantastic, again, it's quite grungy, very poppy, great lyrics in there. It got to number 6 in the charts, did pretty well. The album got to number 5 in the albums chart, so they're now beginning to pick up some success. And the last one of this era is an album called Fishing for Luckies. It actually started again as an EP, but then they combined some other songs onto it and released it as a full album. And again, it's very similar sound. So if you like Cheap Trick and you like grunge, then the Wild Hearts would probably be a band for you. And then the last one, which is a bit later in period, maybe even would be considered more post-grunge than grunge, is a band called Feeder. So Feeder are a Welsh band, formed in 94. They've released 11 albums in total, 43 singles here in the UK, 25 hits in the UK. So a pretty big band over here. They're constantly touring. You quite often see them supporting, because they're part of that Welsh group. You see them quite often supporting bands like Stereophonics or Manic Street Preachers. Really good live. There's two key players, Grant Nichols, who's lead vocals and guitar, and Taka Hiros, who's the bass player. Their drummer, John Lee, unfortunately committed suicide in 2002. And since then, they've just had session musicians replacing him. But they've got three albums that I think fit the grunge sort of description. They became more and more sort of alternative rock, a bit more indie rock as they progressed. But the first album, Polythene, at the time, it was described by NME as the UK's answer to the Smashing Pumpkins, and that probably gives a good description of their sound. Also had a hit in the UK with High, which was their first hit. The second album was called Yesterday Went Too Soon. Now they're making a bit of progress. They got into the top 10 with that album and had a couple of top 10 singles. But the album that I think, if you were going to go and look them up, that I'd suggest you listen to is their third one called Echo Park. That reached number 5 on the album charts. It's beginning to get a little bit more commercialized. There's a little bit more hooks in the songs, but still got that kind of grunge. Their big hit, if you spoke to anybody in the UK and asked them about Feeder, the one song they would know is the one off this, which is a song called Buck Rogers, which was inspired by the TV series, but doesn't actually talk about it. Very hooky, very poppy, but with a real fuzz guitar sound to it. And when I was looking this up, it was described by Wikipedia as grunge. So I thought, well, if they want to call it grunge, it's good enough for me to include here. So here it is. So they're my three bands: Stiltskin, The Wild Hearts, and Feeder.
Nice, very cool.
Would you say post grunge officially begins with Bush?
I don't know. I think Bush is a bit earlier. I think post-grunge sort of starts around 95, 96. I mean, Bush, I think, was still in the early 90s, weren't they, when they came and released. So I'd still think they're the tail end of grunge as opposed to the start of... But who knows? I mean, it's kind of all blurs, doesn't it?
Like it starts with like Days of the New.
Yeah.
I mean, you can keep making grunge further on that sounds like early grunge, but yeah, by 95 or so, it's burning itself out.
What about Sonic Youth?
You know, so industrial.
What about Sonic Youth? Are they sort of progenitors of?
They're more, noise rock, somewhat grungy, more of an alternative thing. They break almost too many rules to be part of it. But
all right, Parish, do you think that you don't want to talk about Radiohead, but thinking of that first album by Radiohead, do you think that there is an inevitable overlap between grunge in the UK with Britpop?
Well, I think there is. I mean, there's definitely an overlap. I mean, Feeder is often lumped in with Britpop, but I don't actually think they sound particularly Britpop. I think they sound more grunge. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, most bands in the UK at that time were more likely to be described as Britpop, I think, as than grunge. Although I don't think anybody would ever describe the Wild Hearts as Britpop, to be fair.
Yeah. You know, it really brings up a good point that as I was kind of alluding to earlier, it's like it's a little unfair. Well, it's unfair to assign grunge to anything outside of Seattle in a way where you're thinking, I guess we're happy for the bands and we respect the bands if they're coming from the same sets of influences. But I have a feeling most of them are just being influenced by, whoa, this grunge thing is huge sort of thing. And they're influenced by the grunge band. So that's not as cool as if you happen to have the same weird, complex influences that the grunge bands actually had, right? Yeah. So, anyway.
And even Heart in the early 90s was like, hey, we're from Seattle, guys. Yeah. They're doing songs with Alice in Chains. They're on the single soundtrack.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to go quickly through a bunch of different things here. I wanted to give a heads up to some seminal pre-grunge. People are starting to forget this Slow EP, Against the Glass from Vancouver, but this is seminal early pre-grunge. There's 6 songs on it. It's 1986, and the grunge guys always think highly of these guys. Come to think of it, No Means No as well was a big influence on grunge. And then Sons of Freedom from 88. This is an amazing pre-grunge, rule-breaking, not exactly a grunge album, but also from Vancouver. Just to finish the Canadian circuit, I don't really have a high opinion of too much that is from, say, Toronto. We had a couple of hair metal bands go grunge at exactly the same time, and they both have two words in their name, and they both start with S. We had Svengali, Go Grunge. We had Slick Toxic, Go Grunge. This is a really obscure album from 98, which is a really cool grunge album, but super late. Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. This is actually a pretty neat album. And just the Whirlwind Tour. I almost would put Helmet in this thing. So Helmet from New York City, somewhat grunge, somewhat hardcore, somewhat mathy hardcore. So they kind of fit. Two Mind bands, Mind Funk and Mind Bomb. These felt pretty grungy to us. Handsome is an offshoot band from. Let me see if it. Yeah, there we go. From Helmet, so sort of a super group. Another obvious one is Dinosaur Jr., right? So Jay Mascis, and they're very noted for the very amazingly molten grungy guitars, and also the bedheaded Dennis the Menace vocals, right? Which is a big grunge thing. This is a great band. We just lost the lead guitarist Todd from this band. Sadly, just died. But Liquid Jesus was a really cool LA. Creative hard rock, alternative rock. I mean, now you're getting into a little bit of that Jane's Addiction world. Nude Swirl, the Big F. So there were all these kind of hard-hitting creative bands, and that's kind of what grunge means, right? Hard-hitting, creative, alternative, or whatever. But there's a bunch of these, right? So yeah, Nude Swirl was from New Jersey. Clutch, I somewhat include early Clutch in this. They're from Germantown, Maryland, right? So they're, cross between stoner rock, blues rock, grunge. It all kind of runs together. One that felt very much part of the grunge scene when we were getting these albums, in real time, was The Fluid from Denver, Colorado. Purple Flake something music, but I had the first one, and it even looks super grungy. And let's see. We have Saigon Kicks somewhat. These are considered grunge / hair metal, more or less, from Florida. But again, creative, Jane's Addiction-y type vocals out of it, but they can be pretty down and dirty and grindy and grungy. So they were kind of in that thing. Oh yeah, there's my early Clutch that I had out. So this kind of stuff, kind of grungy. And then, yeah, the obvious one was Smashing Pumpkins with Gish, so Chicago. This totally fits with Billy Corgan's kind of like teenage naive Dennis the Menace bedheaded vocals, and the heaviness, the Black Sabbath influence. And then
I met him 2 years ago in a record store. It was
nice.
Just me shopping for records.
Yeah, good for you. Cool. And then my final one is my favorite Grunge from Away album, which would be Paw Dragline from Lawrence, Kansas. This is a good one. Absolute masterpiece, as Jamie would say.
I would say mimicking you.
Yeah. And then Death to Traitors was really cool too. And then Home is a Strange Place is like just an EP, 7 tracks. It's kind of weird. And Death to Traitors wasn't even as good as Dragline. So I've got a bit of a falling off with Paw, even though I actually think this is the very best Grunge from Away album. So there's my batch there. I don't know. I would say none of it's really perfectly authentic, because I think most of it is truly just influenced by grunge itself, which is kind of, as they say in the hip hop world, biting on those bands kind of thing, right? So yeah, I think that's about all I've got. Any closing thoughts?
I will say, we just did a taping on Sea of Tranquility of the review crew that I hosted, believe it or not, without Pete. And that debuts on the 17th of February. I don't know when this is debuting. Yep. And I talked about a band called TSO, and they just released their 3rd album last month, or maybe earlier in February, called Hellcare. And it sounds like it should have been released by Nirvana before Bleached. Like, it sounds noisier than Bleached. And they're from Italy. So there's bands still out there releasing grunge music. Listening to it, I felt like I was in 1992 or 93 listening to it, which was kind of cool. So it's still out there being made.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I would like to also just popped up as you were going through your list, Martin. I'm very fond of the this band from the US. I forget where they're from. Red Fang.
Hmm.
Oh yeah.
So Red Fang are classified more or less as a stoner band. They sort of like collapse into that big kind of big black hole where you get like bands which are like YOB, Yob, or whatever, like all these doom bands that fall together. But these guys are basically, especially on their first album, a combination of Queens of the Stone Age with the Melvins, and they have a very strong Melvins aspect to them that easily brings them back to the 90s and to grunge. Later on, they go like Queens of the Stone Age with Mastodon. At some point, it became very fashionable to try to sound and play like Mastodon. But their first album, their first eponymous album, there's a lot of Melvins going on in there. So I think the Melvins they're like a seminal grunge band, almost like a chapter on their own, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we should probably also mention Silverchair from Australia. They were really huge.
There you go.
Another pretty
They
obscure
were
one.
like 14 and 15 on the first album, I think.
Big Chief is a kind of an obscure one and kind of pre-grunge, more like Detroit rock and roll from that area. But yeah, all right. Well, let's wrap it up there. Yeah, I think we more or less covered many of the bases. That's pretty cool. Some good music to check out there. And if you guys, I mean, comment below, let us know who we left out, who are your favorite one or two top grunge from away albums. And yeah, you certainly got a lot to listen to here. And yeah, comment below. You can join our Patreon thing if you want to be part of these panels. But other than that, go listen to some grunge.